Throughout the years, I've noticed this shift when it comes to telling zombie stories. A lot of classic zombie films and games cover the immediate apocalypse, asking the question of how would these characters react while the world is ending. But some more contemporary zombie media ask the question of what comes after the apocalypse. How do you live in a world post-apocalypse? And I find that question to be just as, if not more fascinating than the actual breakout itself. So, when I went into Dying Light 2, I had higher hopes for the story compared to the first game, because one of the most influential and my personal favorite zombie project of the last 20 years more or less answers both questions. The Walking Dead has always fascinated me in a myriad of ways. Not only did it take a book that I like and turned it into an Emmy Award winning show, but then in real time it overextended itself. It turned one show that people liked into 7 different shows to this day, and it's still making new spin offs. The overextension, as well as the behind the scenes issues, showed the decline of the show up until its finale. A show that was on top of the world ended with a whimper, and when I've asked people if they watched the finale, they weren't even aware that the show ended. And that's not just anecdotal evidence, the numbers back it up too. Only about 3 million people watched the finale of the show, compared to the highs of the 10 million who viewed the opening of the third season. At least in my opinion, the ending of The Walking Dead should have been a cultural moment, akin to something like Breaking Bad or The Sopranos, or even Game of Thrones. Who knows, maybe it would have sucked. But instead, the show just ran out of steam. The reason I bring up The Walking Dead is because I view it as a landmarker for gauging the popularity of zombies. Not to say that they weren't popular before or after, since that would be absurd. Films like Romero's Living Dead franchise 28 Days Later, and even more recent films like the South Korean movie Train to Busan, and the recent hype around 28 years later, goes to show that tales about humanity during a crisis as absurd as zombies has always been popular, but nothing quite stood out like The Walking Dead. The show was so popular that it bled into the games industry, causing not just games about the IP itself to appear, but it was a major factor in the pure vomit of unfinished zombie games releasing on Steam Early Access for years. Dying Light was not one of these games. It was a spiritual successor to Techland's previous Dead Island franchise, which was arguably inspired by the Walking Dead comic in some capacity, but Dying Light avoided zombies as a source, and it was actually cited as being influenced by novels such as The Plague and Heart of Darkness, but that's a game I've already talked about at length. Its sequel, however, was inspired by more contemporary works like The Walking Dead and Game of Thrones, and I think that's reflected in the game, which is why I wanted to talk about it today. Unlike the first game, I'm a lot more conflicted when it comes to Dying Light 2. The original has this undeniable charm that more or less excuses the shortcomings of the game in my eyes. The sequel, however, is a game that both succeeds in what it sets out to do and fails in a lot of ways. It's a game that overextended itself and has only really come close to what I believe is the original vision after years of updates and one major expansion. But without rambling any further, this is a critique, commentary, whatever you want to call it, on Dying Light 2 Stay Human Reloaded Edition, which is a stupid name and I hate it. This is also your spoiler warning, as I will be talking about the entire game, but you honestly aren't missing much if you haven't experienced the story. But again, with that out of the way, what better place to start than the beginning of the game? The comparisons between Dying Light and its sequels start instantly. From the moment you boot up the game, you're shown a cutscene that just exposition dumps you in order to get the player up to date with what's going on. Both games have it, but I've never been a fan of this form of exposition, and frankly, I don't think anyone is, but it acts more as set dressing for the game, but it plays every single time you boot up the game, and unfortunately, Dying Light 2's opening cutscene actually contains some important information about the state of the world since we last saw it. Within the opening cutscene, we learn that after the events of the first game, which is left ambiguous because the DLC had 2 endings, a cure for the Huron virus was found and administered, but those dang scientists for the GRE kept messing around and caused an infinitely worse version of the virus to get out and kill literally everybody. Characters in the game will refer to this event as the Fall, and basically what it is that now the world lives in small societies with people dedicated to delivering messages between those societies, since going out is such a risk. Think Death Stranding. Anyway, we also learn that most of the surviving people, and infected for that matter, are held up in a city called Villador, and that's our setting. After that opening cutscene, we actually start playing the game, and one of the first things I noticed is that the game gave me the option to skip the prologue, which is actually a feature that I really like, since the prologue took me about 2 hours to complete, and just having the ability to skip it for repeat playthroughs is a nice touch. Dying Light 2 has a much slower start than the original. Instead of throwing you right into the action, you take your time since the world is different than the last time you saw it. In order to properly guide the player, Aiden is with Spike from the first game, and at this point in his adventure, you two come across a villa where the game stops and lets you smell roses for 20 minutes, doing environmental storytelling, notes, the normal world building stuff. But stop and smell the roses, I did. Dying Light 2's art direction is phenomenal. Throughout the marketing, Techland repeatedly said that the game was going for this modern Dark Ages aesthetic, and for the longest time I just figured that was some marketing jargon. But when I played the game during its launch period, it didn't feel like a Dark Age where society had been stripped down to its bare essentials and everything was on the decline. Honestly, it just felt like Dying Light, but less isolating. In Dying Light 2, you'll find survivors out during the day just chilling on rooftops while zombies shamble below. You'll find random side quests and people sitting around fires telling stories. If anything, the first game felt more like Dark Ages, as throughout the duration of that game, you were alone. It was just you and the zombies with the rare person you come across. That game had amazing atmosphere for that reason. Where Dying Light 2 succeeds is in how the game presents its world post-collapse. You have your standard nature being overgrown, but Dying Light's twist is that now the busy streets have moved up to the rooftops, safe from zombies for the most part. The rooftops themselves have gained new life. Just as people moved up and away from the streets, so has nature, with a lot of the rooftops now being covered in tall, lively grass, flowers, and the occasional wildlife. But even before you get to Villador, you can see how the world itself reacted to the collapse. After you and Spike explore the villa and smell the roses, they have a drink on the roof and look out at the vista, and Spike says, "Who would have thought the end of the world would have been so peaceful?" It's your standard fare post-apocalyptic line about the odd silence that the end of the world often brings when people are gone, but the line really made me think about the art direction of the world. Every time the prologue showed me a vista on my way to Villador, I stopped and appreciated it. I did the little IGN walk. Even later in the game, when I was in the city, if I got a good look at a nice view, I would stop and smell the roses because it was just oddly peaceful. The moment you have with Spike is nice and all, but then he tells you that you two have to split, since you're getting way too attached and you can't have that in the apocalypse as a pilgrim. You leave him for a mini tutorial in parkour and combat, but I want to focus on Spike's reasoning for a moment. This point is brought up over and over and over again, that you always have to move. You can't get too attached as a pilgrim, since you're always leaving, and the job is dangerous. But I actually like how Aiden is opposed to that mentality sometimes. The reason I say sometimes is because you can tell this game went through multiple rewrites. Sometimes he's all for making friends, keeping connections, and, staying human while on this massive goose chase for his sister, but then other times he's cold and disconnected from everyone. Speaking of his sister, I'm just going to get it out of the way now. I don't like this plot point. I'll talk about it later when it becomes relevant, but since the prologue introduces it, I'd figured I'd get it out of the way now. Aiden's quest for his sister actively detracts from the moment-to-moment plot throughout the game, as it's sporadically just thrown into the mix to remind the player that Aiden has external motivations that you just can't get behind because it's not explored enough to mean anything, yet it's constantly told to the player that you need to care about it and that it's your reason to keep going, but again, more on that later. The benefits to the prologue's length is that it takes the time to properly set everything up, as it actually gave me the slightest bit of hope that the game wouldn't have such a lackluster story as I had remembered, especially once I met Hakon. His role in the story is to act as your guiding light at the start. He's this charismatic dick who goes out of his way to help you for absolutely no reason that's apparent to you at least, and he never really explains why. Actually, he does, but that's later on. One thing I don't like about this game's story that's immediate is the fact that I have to keep saying, "I'll tell you that later on," because the game is so insistent on waiting till later on to tell me these things that probably should have been explained to me better at the start to get me more invested in this story. I feel more invested in Hakon than I do Aiden's sister because he feels like the only real character in this game. Everyone else fills a role and sticks to it pretty well, but Hakon feels like he has layers. Granted, it's Dying Light, so the layers are probably like 2, but it feels like he has layers. which sucks when he gets taken out of the story after the first act and only occasionally brought back up. Once you actually reach Old Villador, the prologue spends a good chunk of time trying to make Hakon your bestie, since he's the character whose fate you'll have the most effect on, and I think for the most part that worked, actually, since Hakon was the only character I found myself actually sort of liking throughout the narrative. I had remembered that at some point you have a falling out with him, but I really wish it wasn't as early as it was, because it feels like the game is wasting its best card by ruining this relationship as fast as they do. At least, it feels like they used him very little, but maybe they actually used him the right amount and I simply got sidetracked by the gameplay itself to where the narrative all blended together and was very sporadic feeling. I was able to get so distracted because Old Villador is such a nice setting that I honestly could have spent most of the game there and not have been bothered. But that might have something to do with the actual story being told in Old Villador as well, since that one also kind of interested me. The prologue of the game is so strong and leads so effortlessly into Act 1 that it kind of made me think that Dying Light 2 would have an okay narrative. Dying Light 2 spends its first act establishing how this time it's different from the first game by having the human drama be front and center in a way that the first game really didn't focus on. Narratively, the zombies don't really serve a plot purpose aside from set dressing. Dying Light 2 is a human story, and in order for that human story to work, Techland made the decision to cut back the focus on the zombies since the player, much like the people living with the infected for over 15 years now, are all just used to it by now. And I really like this approach compared to the first game, which was all about trying to prevent the outbreak from spreading further. It's this big, explosive blockbuster that really didn't work. But here, the zombies don't really do much to the overarching plot. They exist as problems the characters have to walk around every day because that's just the world they live in. I was very pleasantly surprised when the game decided that zombies would be pushed to the side and that now we're in a Civil War type plotline. You're first introduced to the survivors. They are the people who try to hang you back at the bazaar, but ignore that. Despite that one event, they're the more peaceful faction. You'll find them out and about during the day, telling stories, farming, and generally avoiding any danger. I absolutely loved finding them around Villador since they remind me to stop and take a breath, smell the roses, something I don't typically do in games like this, but as I mentioned earlier, something about Dying Light 2 just speaks to me when it comes to the way that the world exists. The survivors embody that stop and smell the roses after the world has fallen energy, and I really like that, and it contrasts greatly with the Peacekeepers. The Peacekeepers are the tonal opposite of the survivors. They go around killing infected, trying to keep the streets clean, restore some law and order to the world. Har, har, har. They have the manpower and the weaponry that the survivors don't, and their conflicting worldviews cause this civil war. And I think the game had a real chance to explore these groups further in depth, but instead the game just flat out refuses to go any deeper with these factions. That description I just gave you was pretty much it for characterizations between both factions. Because of this lack of development in both the faction choices, the Peacekeepers are your de facto bad faction choice, because they're obsessed with trying to restore the old world, despite that not being possible. They're chasing a pipe dream, much like the NCR in Fallout. They think that people are just going to agree with how they view the old world and change their entire way of life to try and bring that system back. A system that, even in the modern day, people still can't agree on, and if you look in the world of Dying Light, it's what caused the zombie outbreak. The Peacekeepers are a walking contradiction. They want law and order but will gladly break the law if that means getting a step ahead. They demand respect but will not reciprocate it unless you follow their rules. And when you look at it like that, the Peacekeepers have some sort of depth, as they're given what feels like significantly more content than the survivors, but they're still the evil faction choice. You get the bad ending if you side with them, no matter what. It sucks that the Peacekeepers are the de facto bad ending, because if you explore the Peacekeepers and their general faction quests, you'll find people clashing internally with the ideas that they're fighting for. The main quest even has a branching path to where you can kick out the current leader of the Peacekeepers and assign somebody else if you don't trust that original leader. So they thought of some things about the Peacekeepers, but they still just in the end made them the bad choice. The survivors, on the other hand, aren't given any depth compared to the Peacekeepers. They want everyone to be free, and for everyone to be safe, and for everyone to be happy. There's no motivations on their side of the fence. They just want everyone to be okay with 2 thumbs up. This is also reflected in the side content for the survivors as well. Their quests feel more tangential. Quests that require you to just grab some material and bring it back. Every faction has these quests, but it feels more plentiful with the survivors, as if you're just only doing the fetch work for them. Like, at least the peacekeepers let you do something cool sometimes. I feel like this lack of depth doesn't translate well over to the Civil War story since I'm not given a strong reason to really pick a side. The Civil War plotline allowed Techland to fix the issue of the breakneck pacing of the first game by slowing down a little bit, but instead they have a new issue of that slower time not really being used for anything. Where the first game felt like it was kind of skipping over some story in order to get you back to the gameplay, really only giving you the bare minimum to understand what was going on, Dying Light 2 instead draws out its dialogue sequences since now you can pick what your character says. The drawn out dialogue sequences could work in a game where the characters are fleshed out with proper relationships, not even romantic relationships, literally just friendships that feel like they matter to me and react to me, the player. But the early hours of the game didn't allow me to get invested into the characters or even the main conflict the game presented to me. Instead, it made me feel like I was playing Skyrim, funnily enough. The game let me go, and that's what I did. And I did everything I could early on. I did the side quests, I did the open world filler activities, and I kind of forgot about the main game. This happened time and time again throughout my playthrough, and it's what made me come back to the game because I love getting lost in this world. I love the side quests about love and human connection. They may not mean anything in the grand scheme of things, but doing them is just really fun. I love the way they're written. I love the way Villador feels during the crisp sunset with the looming danger of night ahead, even if the night isn't as dangerous as it was in the first game. Much how Dying Light was very derivative of Far Cry 3, Dying Light 2 is derivative of Skyrim, in my opinion, while maintaining a lot of what made the first game special, so in turn it makes this game feel special, even if I have problems with it. In the amount of time I spent rambling about the game, the story has unfortunately progressed. As I mentioned earlier, you have been thrusted in the middle of this conflict between the peacekeepers and the survivors. It's explained that tensions in Villador are high due to the murder of a high-ranking peacekeeper officer named Lucas. I genuinely forgot his name, so I had to go look that up again. The peacekeepers want revenge for Lucas, but the survivors are insistent they had nothing to do with his murder, so it's up to you to get behind all of this. You can choose to side with Sophie, the leader of the survivors, or with Aitor, an officer of the peacekeepers. Your reason for picking a side in this conflict is because they both promise you that they will smuggle you into the central loop. The reason Aiden is so focused on getting to that central loop is because there's someone at a place called the Fisheye named Lawan that can help him find his sister. A common criticism of the game is feeling like none of your choices really matter, since they all feel like they lead to the same outcomes. Much like other very popular and streamlined RPGs, the game doesn't feel like it exists outside of the player. So when it comes time to make a choice, the game makes sure that you know that it's time to make a choice. In any other RPG, when the character is making a choice, it's presented as if it were any other dialogue option. Maybe it has a little more emphasis on it, but it makes the player feel like everything else in the game also matters because they're placed at the same weight. Dying Light 2, on the other hand, stops the game entirely, puts a big timer on the screen, and then puts a big branching roads graphic, so you know this is an important choice. This one feature that I think they added for player clarity reasons is the number one killer of the branching narrative for a lot of people, since now that you know it's a big one, you can just pause the game, look up what choice you're about to make, and then decide from there. If the game had treated it like any other dialogue option and removed all the obvious attempts at adding tension to your choice, I feel like the branching choices wouldn't have been so lambasted by players. But despite that one massive, glaring, fundamental flaw with the choice system, I actually think the branching narrative is decent for a first attempt. I haven't spoken much about it, but the behind the scenes with this game was famously hellish, since that seems to be the norm with the industries nowadays. The game was forced to be remade from scratch multiple times, and then COVID smacked an additional challenge onto the team, causing the game to release in a state that wasn't to the standard of the fans. The reason I'm not talking about it, though, is because the version of the game that exists today isn't the version from launch. Over the years, there's been various improvements to the gameplay and gameplay-related systems, but unfortunately, not everything could be changed. Systems baked into the campaign from the start, like the narrative choices being so loud and in your face, are a central part to how the game communicates its RPG narrative, and because the game was rewritten however many times, we feel like we're left with what is table scraps of a story. In a game such as Dying Light, I feel like the branching choices actually bring a lot to the table conceptually. It's just the execution on top of a weak script that holds it back. If the game had decided not to make the choices as grandiose in presentation, the game would have benefited a lot, as it would have made the smaller choices feel like they actually matter, even if they didn't. Speaking of impact, it's time for the first major choice of the story. It doesn't actually affect what ending you get, but it is a branching narrative choice. You're given the choice to investigate why Sophie isn't answering her radio or to not. If you decide to check on Sophie like I do, you're presented with an extended gameplay sequence and a boss fight that doesn't end in anyone actually dying. Sophie and her brother will then question your motives, and you can either side with the survivors in the moment, since she'll believe anything you say, no questions asked, or you could choose to be a dick, which she'll just tell you to leave and that's it. However, if you side with Hakan and return to Ador and the Peacekeepers, the quest will just end. You're not given any extended gameplay sequence, and the game just acts like nothing happened. And I kind of like that. I kind of like that you miss out on gameplay depending on which choice you get. Something like that is the bare minimum for a game like this, but since the game is so scared to be a real RPG, you're given nothing, so I'll pick at whatever straws I can get. I feel like this is an example of the missed opportunity that the dialogue and choice system presents a little too often. Instead of the game making dialogue a puzzle of sorts to be solved with the right answers, instead they give you a binary option of yes or tell me more, and sometimes the option will even be no. The option is appreciated, no doubt, but it sometimes leaves you wanting more, especially because later in the story there are some actual choices that have some actual depth. If you're rude to Sophie, the survivors won't hate you here. Even if you do everything in your power to be against the survivors, they still will side with you if you really want to in the end. The factions never explicitly hate you. There's no way of getting locked out of a faction's quests. Both of them will bend over backwards for Aiden, even if he's gone out of his way to disregard them any chance he gets. Even if the game didn't want you to be locked out of quests, there could have been smaller effects, like whatever faction you were actively hated by will say mean things to you, or attack you in the streets, or even give you a worse sale price on some goods at their base vendors. Small things like that would make it feel like your actions have weight in the world, and it would have helped a lot with the immersion and to help distinguish it as a role-playing game compared to the first. The first act wraps itself up a little hastily, as you find out that neither faction actually had anything to do with the death of Lucas. It's revealed that Hakon actually had something to do with the death of Lucas. After being shot by a random arrow, you see that Hakon has a scar from being attacked by Lucas's signature weapon. So, he explains to you that Waltz had put out a hit on Lucas since he had a GRE key and wouldn't hand it over. After this is revealed, you can choose to either help Hakon with the arrow or essentially leave him for dead. I chose to help him since he helped me at the start of the game, so I figured it would essentially even us out. If you help Hakan, you're given a little extra mini quest to try and find the shooter, and then you make your way to the central loop. However, this is cut short when you make your way to an abandoned GRE tunnel. In the tunnel, you're met by Aitor, who actually does change his mannerisms based on if you've sided with the Peacekeepers or not. It's a fun little touch. He has you restore power to the tunnel, but when you do, you're confronted by Waltz. He gives you this whole spiel of, give me the key, and Aiden's like, no, I don't want to. And then he uses his vampire zombie powers, whatever he has, to get the GRE key from you, and he kills all of the Peacekeepers there except Aitor. This leads them to an abandoned car dealership where he uses the key to activate some sort of console, but when I was going through the section, for some reason my dialogue had cut out, and only the dialogue had cut out. So I had the audio, which is pretty funny, but I had subtitles so I still knew what was going on. Here's that clip.
Good. Before I kill you, you'll get a chance to witness something spectacular.
Anyway, the sniper from earlier, who is actually the woman you were looking for the whole time, named Luan, helps you escape Waltz and takes you to the central loop, ending the first act of the game and introducing you to the real meat and bones of the game world. Despite my criticisms of the first act, I actually enjoyed it a little bit when I was playing through it. The slower nature of the conflict is interesting, since there are one-dimensional characters on both sides, which I like. I couldn't tell you their names since they've been pretty much ejected from my memory after that first act, but you see both sides of the conflict, and during my playthrough, I sided with the survivors for two main reasons. The first reason is simply for the fact that you get the good ending when you side with them, but the second reason is because, in my opinion, you get better gameplay items for allocating resources to that faction. Let's talk about that for a moment since Act 2 is pretty slow. I decided to wait until now to talk about the gameplay as a whole since Act 2 is where I spent most of my time playing the game and doing all the activities, and I feel like this is honestly where Dying Light 2 excels. The game actually has quite a bit of variety when it comes to the open world activities. There are so many of them that you'll find yourself always having something to do when going between quests. Stumbling across them all feels organic since combat and exploration is probably what you want to do instead of the main quest, so the game satiates that desire. When returning to the game, I was kind of shocked at just how much there actually was since I didn't remember a whole lot, but that's more or less because I really didn't take my time with the game when it came out. Well, that and a lot of it is kind of similar. You have your basic stuff in the form of windmill towers to create safe zones, but you also have bandit camps and metro tunnels, which are just a smaller version of bandit camps that allow for fast travel. You also have airdrops, radio towers, which are just climbing. But then you have your more hands-on activities, like the world bosses in the form of GRE anomalies, the GRE containment zones, the water towers, and the electrical stations, as well as the parkour and combat challenges. None of these things are new, per se. You aren't going to find some mind-shattering new form of open-world activity in Dying Light 2. What you will find is incredibly solid iterations of that standard Ubisoft open world. The most creative of the lot would definitely be the electrical stations, since they all involve you finding a way to connect a wire to a circuit breaker, but the layout of the levels requires you to find just the right combination of spots in order to not overextend the length of the cable. Again, these aren't mind-blowing, but they're fun. They don't overstay their welcome, since they have enough variety to keep you not disinterested. I even found the simple stuff like bandit camps and windmills to be worthwhile because it leaves an impact on the world. Typically in these types of games, doing camps and towers are just passive ways to help the player, showing more of the map and creating fast travel points. Dying Light 2 instead benefits from having such a wide variety of bandit camps and windmills because most of them create safe points around the map, which in turn helps you during the night when you want to end a volatile chase, or even just sleeping through the night. It's a little thing, but the fact that you actually feel rewarded for clearing these side objectives and it leaves a tangible mark on the world gives me all the reason to actually complete them. One aspect I noticed about the sheer variety of the base type encounters is just how they differ. In other games, it's easy to have them all blend together, but in Dying Light 2, they have different mechanics based on the type of base. I know, this isn't world-shattering, but I like it. The bandit camps and the metro tunnels are the most similar since both can be done in stealth, but the metro tunnels in specific feel like they're meant to be done in stealth since it's such a tight space with not many environmental hazards to help the player. But where the metro tunnels are long and often require you to do another put the wire in the circuit breaker puzzle after the combat encounter, the bandit camps are a lot more vertical with multiple levels and boss type enemies at the end of each floor. But without a doubt, my two favorite activities were the GRE encounters. The first of which are GRE anomalies, open world boss encounters with a big ol' asterisk next to it. The reason I say the big ol' asterisk is because it's the same boss fight every single time, and in a game starved for boss type encounters, I feel like a little more variety in these fights would have gone a long way, maybe a different enemy or two different enemies. But as they exist now, they're fine. A fun little boss challenge if you're not overleveled, but once you are overleveled, it's just a cakewalk. They're fun little encounters, but they leave you wanting more. The same thing, however, isn't really applied to the GRE containment zones. I really like those. These are just the dark zones from the first game, but now they're done in the open world instead of a different loaded instance. Much like the anomalies, you're supposed to do these at night since that's when all the dangerous infected are out, but you can do them during the day, but it's going to be a lot harder since they'll still roam the buildings. It's basically guaranteed death, but it's still technically possible. The reason I think these two work so well is because they change up the gameplay just enough to where it's slightly now a challenge. The GRE anomalies require you to balance fighting a boss and a ton of zombies on the side. The containment zones provide a stealth challenge almost because you can sneak past all the zombies, and it's kind of hard to actually sneak past them all because it takes time, and often you don't have a lot of time. Or if you don't want to take the slower, stealthy approach, you can go in and beat the shit out of every zombie with a baseball bat, but you can get overwhelmed at times and actually die because, quite frankly, they put a lot of zombies in these small rooms. They will grab you. The parkour and combat challenges also exist, but that's really all there is to say about those. They're inoffensive. Sometimes they're actually good, but they never stand out in my mind. Despite being the most basic form of open world filler and not being the most engaging, they're not nearly as bad as some other attempts I've seen from bigger studios. And as I've mentioned earlier, none of these activities are special by any stretch of the imagination, but they're all incredibly solid. It left me wanting a little more from these activities, but honestly, every open world game leaves me wanting more from these activities. Talking about this game is like running in circles. I keep coming back to the game under delivering on a front I didn't expect much delivery on, but then I can go on and find something else in the game that I absolutely adore. But of all the things that I wanted more from, I wanted more from the RPG gameplay. I just wanted to feel like a presence in this world, like the game promised. I talked about how doing certain activities created safe zones throughout the city, and I do like that feature, but a large part of this game would have you think that the world will change massively depending on who you side with, and the closest I feel like the game got was during the faction allocation, which was not entirely thought out in my opinion. A big selling point was, again, how the world would change based on your actions. You've heard it a million times for every single game like this. Here, it technically can change. When you do a water tower or when you do an electrical station, you're given the option to choose who gets this power, the survivors or the peacekeepers. And based on whoever you choose, one of the factions will earn a little point on their track at the bottom of the screen. In theory, the more you level, the more you get back. It's a feedback loop, but the system leaves absolutely no room for experimentation. Once you allocate a faction point, there is no changing it. There's no redoing the water tower or the electrical station to reassign a point. So instead of being able to see if you like the parkour additions by the survivors or the more trap-centric features of the peacekeepers, you're essentially forced to choose a side from the start and stay on that side the entire track. In my playthrough, I chose 9 survivor upgrades, but at one point I chose a peacekeeper upgrade, and so I can't entirely fill the progress bar at the bottom by reassigning power structures in the world. As it stands, in this RPG where my choices matters, I'm forced to make a choice at the start of the game that locks me in with whatever faction I choose. This doesn't have any narrative feedback to the player. There's no reason for it to be truly restricted. The peacekeepers won't hate you if you assign every single point to the survivors, but I'm still restricted in the sandbox for whatever reason. This is by far the oddest choice to me, since this is still a sandbox game. They haven't fully committed to an RPG. Maybe I'm looking too deep into this and they just didn't think it out, but I feel like this feature is most representative about the game. It shows that the studio wasn't quite ready for an RPG in my opinion. The systems in place from a gameplay standpoint that should emphasize RPG gameplay forget to react to my choices as a player, except for that one choice I made at the start of the game that dictated which survivor track or which peacekeeper track I'm going to stick through the entire time. I'm not trying to sit here and sound like an armchair dev, because that's not my forte. I don't make games. But I feel like the decision to lock players out of resource reallocation does more to harm the overall world feel than anything in the narrative. It was my biggest disappointment throughout the entire game because it was the part of the game that I feel like I should have been able to control. I know the narrative is bad and I know it's pretty linear, but I was expecting the gameplay to be up to me, but it feels like it was stripped away from me as soon as I allocated that first resource point. One thing that I do like about the faction allocation is that your safe zones in each area are dependent on which faction has control in that region. It's a small thing that adds to the immersion that the game so desperately needs, since the entire narrative places you at the center of everything, and rightfully so, since I would not want a fully upgraded Aiden on my bad side. This game has some of the best progression out of any open world Ubisoft RPG type game I've played in a while. Gone are the 4 skill trees of last game, and now they've been consolidated into just 2 trees, combat and parkour. Each level up inside of these trees feels unique and as if you're actually getting stronger. I said the same thing about the first game's skill trees, and here it reigns true as well, but with a little more streamlining. The only downside of Dying Light 2's skill trees is that I don't think it was actually meant to be completed in one playthrough. What I mean is that in the first Dying Light, by the time you were done with the story, you would have completed 1 or 2 trees. But here, by the time I completed my 50-hour playthrough including the DLC, I still hadn't reached legend levels. This slowed sense of player progression has this leaking effect throughout the rest of the game. Since the game is now technically an RPG, it takes more time to reach the same highs that you did in the first game since that game was shorter. You now have these big player levels, not unlike the newer Assassin's Creed titles, but they only go up to level 9. And for the longest time, I actually didn't understand how the main leveling system worked, or even how some of the loot worked, since in my first playthrough all those years ago, I essentially ignored all the RPG isms of the game. The RPG systems in general are the most criticized aspect of this game, for rightful reason, so instead of beating around the bush, let's take a look at it for a second. So, on the top of the screen you have your player level. This dictates if you're on level for an area, since each region has a recommended level, like Far Cry. I don't like this decision because the game is about combat and exploration and parkour, so now you're funneled into these areas, taking the game region by region in the manner Techland decided, because if you enter a level 4 region at level 1, the enemies will deal a lot of damage to you and you will do nothing in return. But don't worry, this can be offset a little bit by the extra armor system. In the first game, costumes were just that. They were costumes, they had no external effect on your character. But now, in Dying Light 2, they use armor, and it's a bit confusing. So you have this small number in the corner, which is the actual level of the gear, which makes sense. Then each piece has its individual stats. Those don't really do anything early on, because the percentages are so minuscule, yada yada. You've played these types of games before. But oddly enough, some armor pieces also have a gear armor stat. The purpose of the stat is to help reduce damage, but I never really noticed a difference since this game doesn't have proper build crafting. You can have a full set of armor and have benefits with that armor, or you can mix and match armor to closely match your Aiden to how you want to play, but at the end of the day it doesn't feel like it was intentional. It feels half-baked. Techland using Dying Light 2 to test out if they want to go in on RPG systems is fine for their first attempt, but future installments need to figure out whether they want to be an RPG or an action game first and foremost, since this middle ground clashes with player progression in a tangible way. I can feel myself being neutered by these percentage increases. I don't feel myself getting stronger over long periods of time like I did in the first game, because, oh, now I do plus 13% damage instead of 100 better damage. Especially because this game doesn't have any challenging endgame RPG content to where I would need the 13% healing boost. That's not to say it's all bad, though. I love the changes to the skill tree, like I mentioned before, and I love how the weapons work now. But the micromanaging of stats under a confusing system doesn't help to show players what can be done in this system, and honestly, I don't think I ever figured it out truly myself. No matter what I did to my Aiden, he kind of felt the same, whether I was using a bow, a sword, a gun, a hammer. But I have a feeling that's because these games don't really understand why the RPG systems they're trying to copy work so well. When games started chasing the lucrative RPG-adjacent game in recent years, a lot of them copied Borderlands and Diablo without actually understanding why those games had loot that worked as well as it did. In those games, the incremental increases pair with the builds that you select in the skill tree, so they would further amplify your build. The skill tree and weapons work together, so naturally, some weapons wouldn't be good for some builds. In Dying Light 2, all the build crafting is done through the weapons and the armor, so the skill tree is its own entire entity, it's separate, and that's how I didn't interact with it all those years ago. The game has incremental increases to damage with certain armor pieces, but in reality it didn't do anything for me because I can get my percentage of damage to go high if I wear all the right armor, but I don't have to because I don't have any perks that specialize in me hitting guys with two-handed hammers. And because the armor dictates literally everything, if I want to use a bow for one encounter, I can just put on my bow armor. I don't have to respec my skills or anything. No matter what stats I micromanaged on my character, it never felt like I had a build going in the same way that you have a build in Dark Souls. Combat felt the same regardless. Granted, that combat is very satisfying, but it never felt like I was being rewarded for finding a build like in other action RPGs. But that's enough about the skills and the builds. I want to focus on the combat real quick since that's the biggest area of improvement across these two games. One of the biggest complaints about Dying Light was that fighting human enemies never felt good, since all you did was just sidestep, swing, sidestep, swing. There wasn't a flow to human combat since they would just guard you and you would just have to wait for them to swing so you could kick them. Or, if you had a gun, the encounter was over like this. Combat in Dying Light 2 feels more like a rhythmic motion. It's not quite as smooth as some other action games, but it feels like they have more weight now since you have moves such as a parry. You now have to dictate whether an attack should be blocked or if you have to move out of the way since it'll be a power attack, and enemies now attack more frequently, so you have to think a little faster. To help you out, combat arenas now have random throwables ranging from glass bottles to bricks to now full-on spears, which will give you the upper hand in combat if you're overwhelmed, or you can use it as a little strategic advantage. Because Tekken increased the amount of enemies and how often they'll swing at you, the player now has the option to also overwhelm enemies. When they released their big combat update, they fixed a lot of the gore and physics issues, but they also added this execution feature that allows you to kill an enemy if you break their stamina meter, and it can act as this get-out-of-jail-free card. Pairing those with head stomps, drop kicks, and other environmental hazards made me look for ways to faster drain their stamina or knock enemies over in order to get a quick and easy kill. Pairing those with the grappling moves, parkour attacks, and environmental hazards leads to a combat system that never got boring for me, despite it being a 50-hour playthrough. As a whole, the combat is just more visceral than the first game, since combat encounters always left me at low health and the healing items weren't a luxury I could afford, but that has more to do with how the healing works and the healing economics in the game. Dying Light 2 doesn't have normal medikits that you just buy once and use like every other game. Instead, you have these medicine packs that can be upgraded, and you have different rarities of health items in your inventory. So, for example, a green health pack can heal 100 health in 5 seconds. This is different from, say, a purple health pack that can heal 250 in 3 seconds. The downside of this system is that if you upgraded a blueprint of your medikit to high enough rarity and you don't have enough materials to actually build it yourself, you can't dismantle lower rarity health kits to get the materials to craft the better ones, and it just so happens that vendors don't sell the high rarity ones, so this often just left me without heals. As I mentioned earlier, it helps keep up the tension in combat, but it just ends up getting on your nerves after a while. But that's just your primary healing. There's other ways to heal yourself in the form of these boosters. Boosters are these little inhalers that give you a passive ability over time like health regeneration or resistance to a certain type of attack. But in all honesty, I didn't even use these until I played New Game Plus. That's when they felt most appropriate to use since nothing in the base game ever scales to such a challenge. But vendors also don't like selling those in high rarities, so it's basically the same story as medkits. Since you have to craft healing items using resources that aren't uncommon but aren't entirely common either, you could try and make it a read into the scarcity of health items, playing into the post-apocalyptic nature of Dying Light, or how the world is so unforgiving and the existence of healing items are a true luxury, and I would have agreed with you until I reached the third act. Around that point of the game, I passed this event horizon when it came to healing items. I can't even pinpoint when it happened, but at some point I just started swimming in healing items, so that read I presented a second ago could be sort of true, but in reality I think it's just more a poor balancing of the healing items. Speaking of poor balancing, Act 2's narrative is almost non-existent, which makes it easy to get lost and do a lot of the fun side content, but it comes with this side effect of forgetting what was the last thing to happen in the main story, especially since it's a lot of busy work in order to prepare you for this big raid on this radio communications tower. This mission is probably the most memorable in the game since the radio communications tower is the largest tower in the game. You help a squad of peacekeepers storm the tower, and it's the closest I got to actually liking any of the characters that the game threw at me. It's obvious that they're gonna die since the game takes the time to give you the classic military guys bonding before the big mission that usually involves the death of a character, but it just so happens that in this case, every peacekeeper you go with dies, so you need to climb to the tower by yourself. You're given a grappling hook, and the climb to the top is great. The music swells the higher you go on this long, treacherous climb. It's a lot like climbing the radio tower in the first game, but much like this game compared to the first, it feels more ambitious. And much like the rest of the game, that ambition is stomped out by Tekken themselves. Throughout the climb, you're constantly radioed by Lawan, who is worried about you, so she decides that she's also going to climb to the top. And when you get there and make your choice about who gets access to the radio tower, she's already up there. She climbs the tower at a superhuman speed so she can talk to you at the top and usher you into the third act, since the game now wants to enter 6th gear to wrap up its story. Some people online talk about how it undermines your accomplishment or makes the whole mission void, and I don't quite see it like that. I think it's just a little funny thing that Tekken didn't really think about, but what it does is feel like the story is just forcing itself back onto me. The next mission is about Lawan and discovering a little more about her backstory, especially with Hakan. You explore her apartment for some forced character drama. It's the game overexerting itself, trying to get you back on track, forcing this weird dynamic into the last few hours of the story. In my playthrough, Lawan became my love interest. I'm not exactly sure how, but she did, and the game tried to leverage this when it came to how I dealt with Hakan later, but it just kind of left me confused because I didn't feel like it really went anywhere. This isn't a character-based RPG where you do missions to build bonds with certain characters. You rarely actually spend time with these characters, so forcing me into this situation just didn't work for me. And instead of choosing based on which characters I wanted to live and build bonds with, I instead just chose whatever I thought would give me the good ending, since the game does have a predetermined sense of morality. Everything in this RPG feels so predetermined that it makes me beg the question, why make it an RPG? It doesn't use the extended systems to expand the narrative and the themes, it just keeps going on and occasionally remembers it can ask the player how they feel. Since the game is so determined to show how much larger it is than its predecessor, I spent a lot of my playthrough trying to look for any sort of deeper theme, and honestly it was kind of hard for me considering how bare bones the story is. The theme that's most obvious, I would say, is revenge, since the entire game is about getting back at somebody or somebody trying to get back at somebody else. You want to get back at Waltz for being evil, Lawan wants to get back at Hakan for being a dick, the survivors want back at the peacekeepers for being a nuisance. Everyone is stuck in this cycle of hate, so it leaves the world in this metaphorical and literal nuclear arms race to try and get a happy ending that they want, and you more or less have to pick which side of revenge you want. A second ago, I said literal and metaphorical nuclear arms race, and I'm not even kidding. I don't know how I forgot about this plot point from my first playthrough, but it's revealed at some point that Waltz is just gonna blow up the city. It made me laugh, and it quite literally just came out of nowhere. It's why the third act suffers as much as it does. Instead of drawing a natural conclusion between the survivors and the peacekeepers, since they've been a focal point of the entire game, the final mission involves you storming this X-13 facility to stop Waltz from blowing up the city. Waltz wants to use it to save Mia since he thinks it contains the key to her survival, but it just so happens that X-13 has an automatic response built in that was intended to destroy the city in the event of a mutated Haran virus like we see in the game spreading as it did. On sheer technicality alone, the game wraps itself up because this is the end of the game, but nothing actually feels conclusive about this ending in my opinion. You confront Waltz, who reveals that all the backstories the game has been showing you were kind of lies. Mia isn't actually your sister, she's your good friend. Mia's actually Waltz's daughter. This development comes completely out of left field, and it doesn't work as the twist because I was never connected enough to Mia in the first place to really care. I'm sure for Aiden this was heartbreaking, but for me, the player, who got lost in the side content for half my playthrough, it doesn't recontextualize anything, nor does it stop me from doing what I was here to do in the first place. I'm still just gonna save Mia. Since Waltz is so dead set on trying to save Mia, you have to fight him in order to get this GRE key back and stop the missiles from going off, and this boss fight is downright horrendous. A lot of people criticize the QuickTime event boss fight with Rise from the first game, but I honestly think I prefer it compared to what was given here. The first part of this fight involves you just fighting Waltz with your weapons like any other enemy, but he does his vampire zombie super moves things and you have to deal enough damage to enter the second part of the fight, which involves you fighting him with your infected zombie powers that you've been given throughout the story periodically. The game has teased you with these powers at various scripted segments, and it's nothing special. You get funny vision, your audio gets diluted, and you swing your arms like a mindless creature. So naturally, they made you fight Waltz with this very limited moveset, and instead of feeling like a feral duel or a clash of willpower, I instead was just frustrated, because despite me being over-leveled for the activity, I still felt like I was doing zero damage to him. So after a few minutes and a few attempts at clobbering Waltz, you defeat him and he drops the key in a pool of chemicals. Well, now there's nothing you can do. Game over. All jokes aside, Aiden kind of just sits there and accepts defeat until Lawan radios in and tells him that she plans to detonate the explosives to destroy the missiles before they can launch, which will destroy X-13 and possibly herself. Aiden then must choose if he's going to save Mia or save Lawan. This is your last big choice of the game, and I'll give Techland their props. It feels like the most reactive. If Aiden goes to save Lawan, you both leave the X-13 facility. However, the missiles still go off and destroy Villador, killing a majority of the population. But if Aiden goes to save Mia, you take her out of the X-13 facility and it's destroyed in the explosion. The city is spared from destruction, and Mia dies shortly after due to her weakened condition and is buried by Aiden. Meanwhile, Villador falls under the control of whatever faction Aiden supported the most. If the Peacekeepers take over, the game lets you know that this definitely was not the good option. Riots will bust out in the street, the cutscene takes place during the dark, and overall, they just have a very fascist angle to them. Comparatively, the cutscene with the survivors is very happy, the sky is colorful, everyone lives happily ever after, and at the end, Aiden hops and skips away. The game never really went far enough to show the players why the world ended up the way it did within the cutscenes. If you side with the Peacekeepers throughout the game, they aren't inherently evil, the same way the Legion are in Fallout New Vegas, but they definitely aren't the good guys. The survivors, on the other hand, just don't have a future in this world, in my opinion. Yes, they live happy and free now, but that's just not sustainable in this type of world, as we've seen across other post-apocalyptic media. Not to come off as this enlightened centrist, but neither side felt particularly good to me, since either way you're just repeating history from a different starting point. But that's neither here nor there, since if I were to try and politically analyze this game, I think I would have a stroke. But that's not it for your choices, since you are given one last cutscene. No matter what, Aiden ultimately decides to leave Villador due to his infection, and he wants to continue his journey as a pilgrim. Depending on your choice, however, if you spare Hakan, he will save Lawan from X-13's destruction, and Lawan will leave the city with Aiden. But if you choose to save Lawan, and Hakan is still alive, he will leave the city with you. If Hakan dies at all, you walk away alone regardless. I'm not a huge fan of this all-or-nothing approach that the game takes. Apocalyptic media is about trade-offs, stakes, and very rarely do characters get their good ending unless it's highly deserved. Dying Light 2's best ending doesn't feel deserved, it just feels like they needed that goody two-shoes ending to satisfy people. But where the base game fails, in my opinion, the DLC kinda makes up for it. Dying Light 2 received a plethora of DLC throughout its lifetime, most of which were either free quality of life updates or paid cosmetics. Bloody Tides was the first actual DLC released for the game, with the planned DLC 2 being turned into the upcoming Dying Light The Beast spin-off game. Bloody Ties is fine. This is my first time playing it. I'll get to that in a second, but it was actually the free updates that made me really enjoy my time more this time around compared to the first time, because a lot of the free updates added stuff that was missing when I first played it. Stuff like improved gore, better ragdolls, better weapon customization, fixing the way weapon repairing worked, a new faction system, but it did have a massive step back in my opinion, that being guns. When the game was confirmed to not have guns pre-release, I was apparently the only person who was happy with the change, considering how busted yet awful they felt in the first game. But for years, people continuously asked Tekon to add guns, so they added guns. But even after they added guns, the game director himself went on record saying that he still believed in that initial version of the game, but decided to ultimately listen to the community regardless. In a PC Games End article, he said, quote, "The lack of firearms in the original release was important for two reasons. First, we needed that for world building, reinforcing the modern Dark Ages direction. The big idea was that humankind had collapsed. The civilization, the industry is gone, and no one is really capable of making guns, especially because the existing ones have been seized by the military. Secondly, we wanted to emphasize how important melee weapons are for Dying Light as a franchise," end quote. The removal of guns allowed the combat to breathe more, in my opinion. It allowed for there to be combat encounters that pushed the player at times, especially towards the end of the game where you had to fight off what amounted to roomfuls of enemies, where in the first game you would just have a shooting encounter. For the most part, the base game is still the same, since the quest to even unlock the ability to use guns is optional, but if you do unlock guns, it creates a major problem. The guns in Dying Light 2 scale with the player, so you never need to upgrade your weapon if you don't want to. And it has this side effect where now they're even more busted than the first game, because enemies don't shoot back because enemies in the base game don't have guns. And the worst part is that the guns don't feel good to shoot here either. They all feel like I'm using a shotgun from the original Doom, and they just delete enemies without them being able to react. Now, you could try and make the same argument about bows, since they are in the game and they're pretty good, but the trade-off with bows is that they're more of a stealth option since they take a while to draw back and get the power shot ready. Even then, they're not always a guaranteed one-shot kill, so it doesn't really have the same overpowered effect as guns. Regardless of how I feel though, as I mentioned earlier, this is entirely optional, and I didn't really interact with the guns because I didn't feel like doing the quests for the gun faction, because the factions are pretty grindy. The factions that they added post-launch were actually a cool idea, and I actually really like them. It gives you a reason to interact with the world, and overall it just gives you something to do. I did just say that they were grindy, but that's 100% what their intention is. It's to give the player something to do after the game is done, a reason to keep going and to keep doing the New Game Plus cycles, since this game has New Game Pluses that scale higher and higher and higher up to, I think, New Game Plus 9, I'm not quite sure. The factions giving you a reason to keep going with exclusive missions and rewards isn't something that the game needed, but it was a cool addition to come across, even if I didn't grind them all too much because of just how long they take to grind. But the meat of this big 2.0 Reloaded Edition sandwich is the DLC Bloody Ties. Originally, it was sold separately, but once DLC 2 was revealed to now be a separate game, it was just bundled in for anyone who already owned the game and anyone who buys the game in the future. While this is an expansion, it's not as big in scale or quality as the following, and what it offers is just capital F fine. At the start, Bloody Ties feels like it was a response to the base game in a lot of ways. The story's actually not half bad this time, with characters that almost get you invested in the drama. The gameplay is put front and center though, since this is an expansion about gladiator arenas with fun spins on your standard race and combat challenges, and overall it was a very pleasant surprise based on how little fanfare it actually got. When trying to do research about the expansion, I was genuinely having issues trying to find anything other than reviews, since there isn't even a Wikipedia page or subpage dedicated to this DLC, and the one on the Dying Light wiki is bare bones to say the least. It more or less fell to the wayside despite it releasing the same year as the base game, with most major reviewers skipping the expansion entirely, and that's because it really doesn't feel like an expansion of the game. The DLC takes you to this Thunderdome-inspired arena where you complete a certain amount of challenges to continue the story, much like the following in its reputation meter, but where that expansion fleshed out the game by giving you an entire new countryside and a car with its own skill tree, Bloody Ties just gives you more of that base game. It feels like something that would have been given out as a content drop instead of like a major expansion. It's on the same level as the faction quest that they dropped for free. Okay, I'm being a bit hyperbolic here, but the bare-bones nature of the DLC, despite its production value, does hurt it a little bit. The expansion follows Aiden as he finds this gladiator arena in the middle of Villador and befriends a fellow combatant named Chiro. After a short introductory battle, some evil guy named Skullface shows up and ruins the show. Aiden and Chiro then both try and enter the main event, which requires them to prove their might in different challenges. Some are races, some involve defeating a big boss, moving items, or whatever else the game wants you to do. Narrative aside for a moment, I will say one thing that was instantly noticeable was the improvement to character writing. Now, this is still Dying Light, so it's not the greatest by any stretch of the imagination, but in Bloody Ties, Aiden actually felt more like a character. The writers decided to morph him into another flavor of just white guy sarcasm, but it's better now, because now Jonah Scott feels a little more natural in the booth as Aiden, and he has this rapport with Chiro that actually made me sympathize with him a little bit, and understand him, since he and Aiden both talk like actual friends would. But even when the game was starting to get on my good side when it came to the character writing, it just stops. After you enter Carnage Hall, you can talk to Chiro every few matches and reflect with him about how everything is changing and where you both stand, but he doesn't tell you anything actually new after the first few. Every single time it's some reiteration of him talking about how he's going to show his dad that he's a fighter and he's going to beat Skullface and he's going to become the ultimate champion of the arena. The entire story revolves around Chiro and his family, since Chiro's father doesn't want to lose another son to the arena like he did with his last son, Abel, but Chiro sees this as his dad viewing him as weak, since his dad was also a fighter, so that would leave him as the only man in the family who wasn't a fighter. It's a miscommunication that would fit right in with a Disney Channel original movie, but instead it involves bashing people's skulls in with a baseball bat instead of someone just going through a change. The game could have used this as a commentary on the cycle of violence, or how violence is what some people view manhood as, and how that's not really a good thing, but instead, much like the base game, it doesn't really intend to explore anything deeper than what is presented at the surface level. After that initial premise of the story, it more or less takes a backseat as your main goal is to climb to the top of the ranks by completing challenges like I mentioned previously. It's all just simple and straight to the point. It's all just variations on races or combat challenges like in the base game. But there's some original challenges in there that are actually pretty fun, and it just leaves you wanting more. Like a taste of something that could come later, but it never really does. Much like the factions update, Carnage Hall has a faction reward system that encourages you to play the events over and over again to get these upgrades to your equipment, especially this little shield piece you unlock at the end of the expansion, and it's honestly pretty cool. I didn't really use it because it's just a little stat stick and the combat was already easy enough at this point to where I didn't need it, but like I said, cool little addition and I liked it in New Game Plus. But the fact that the shield you get, your pinnacle reward for doing everything, is just fine says a lot about the game itself, honestly. Everything about the expansion and the base game just feels fine. So mind-numbingly fine that I can't bring myself to think, much less talk about anything in depth, because it doesn't offer anything in depth. I feel like I'm going crazy because I've been talking about this game for however long I'm recording this, and I don't feel like there's anything here to talk about. Much like the base game, the only depth sprinkled over here is the RPG mechanics that translate over to the story, and I'll admit, they're kinda cool here. What made the DLC worth the 5 or so hours I spent with it was the final hour or so, since it just goes full throttle and it kept my interest relatively high. So, as you climb the ranks, Aiden can grow more and more distant with Churro, and your relationship with him plays a major part in the finale because you actually have to fight him for a chance to fight Skullface. Based on your bond as a player with Churro, you can choose to fight him to the death or just not fight him at all, and the game actually adjusts itself based on your choice in a major way. If you choose to kill him, that's it. He just dies right there at your hand. But if you leave him alive, he can come back and help you when it's time to fight Skullface. And when you fight Skullface, it's actually the best in the game by a country mile. It's the closest the game comes to having actual mechanics with a boss fight, and your limited loadout actually made it pretty tense on the higher difficulties. But if you chose to save Churro, once you get Skullface to lose a good chunk of health, Churro will come in and kill a brute zombie for you, since without him you would have had to balance fighting Skullface and the brute zombie. It felt like a nice touch that the game actually made my life a little easier, because I chose to be sympathetic towards Churro and not just slaughter him in the arena. But after you beat Skullface in a fight, it's revealed that Skullface was actually Abel all along. This was something that the game has been trying to help you piece together slowly throughout the runtime, and if you keep Churro alive, you can give him the Skullface mask, breaking the cycle of violence, I think. The reason I say I think is because, in all honesty, I don't know. Aiden tells Churro that the arena lost this time, but it just ends abruptly. You wake up in your room with a badass shield, and you can continue to fight or go back to Villador, but there is no genuine thematic conclusion to the DLC. My entire time with the DLC was spent thinking that the main theme had something to do with familial legacy, the cycle of violence, sins of the past, or literally anything, but apparently I was super wrong for even thinking that the story would conclude. Maybe the real message was that violence is good or something, and that's why it's an uphill battle for me to figure this out. In all seriousness, this disappointed me beyond belief. I wasn't expecting a lot, since these games aren't very good at wrapping up themselves, but this is a comical low in how bad the storytelling ends. It didn't detract from the whole experience, but instead it just feels like an odd footnote to remember my time with this DLC. Overall, I liked my time with the game significantly more than the first time I played it all those years ago, and revisiting it allowed me to clear my head when it came to this game, since it existed as this fragmented memory where all I could say was, yeah, it was fine. As a whole, the game is very much like the first in the case that the strengths still lie in the gameplay, side content, and exploration, while the weaknesses are still the lackluster narrative and the fact that it's confused on what it wants to be story-wise. The reason I keep talking about the first game is because of just how much that game is still here. Dying Light 2 is a evolution and a regression at the same time. The endgame is a substantial improvement over the first, with, like I mentioned earlier, factions, scaling New Game Plus, and all the updates shape this game into something that is genuinely good and could rival the first game depending on what you value from these games. But after wrapping everything up, I stared at my notes and thought to myself, do I like this game more than the first? It's hard to say. It's a tacky answer, but they both have their strengths, and I would be lying if I said the original Dying Light didn't have this simplistic charm on its side. I may have been pretty negative in this video, but don't get it wrong. I love both of these games. I think Dying Light 2 would have come out on top for me simply because both games have the same weaknesses, and Dying Light 2 has the better gameplay, but Dying Light 2 falls short because it never had its the following moment. It's missing that piece of the puzzle that completes the original, in my opinion. Without that, 2 feels a little naked by comparison. By all means, Dying Light 2 just got a better version of Bozak Horde, but it never got the real game-changing DLC since they were so focused on updates akin to a live service than an actual expansion release. Especially since the new The Beast was supposed to be DLC 2 before getting turned into its own thing. This game is a mess, an overly ambitious mess that I can't help but love. Despite my never-ending issues with the game that I kept tossing back at it, Dying Light 2 just kept giving me more fun shit to play. Dying Light 2 is a game that tries so hard to be larger than the sum of its parts, and I think in doing that, the game just became all of its own parts for better and for worse. There is no greater cause here. It's just Dying Light 2. That probably doesn't make any sense when I say it out loud, but to me, that makes sense, and this is my video, so that's a hearty dose of Nana Nana and Boo Boo. You know, it's actually kind of funny how I started this video talking about The Walking Dead and how it went out on a whimper and how you can use that as a benchmark for zombie popularity, but that same illusion kind of works for how Dying Light 2 ended. Not the benchmark for zombie popularity part, but the fact that it was building up itself as something really good, and I was really liking it until the third act of the story just kicked me, and then the immediate gut punch afterwards of Bloody Ties not having an ending. It made the game lose all steam for me. It dragged down the highs and the rest of it in retrospect now that I know where it ended up. But again, I'm going to reiterate this until I die. Does this mean that I hate this game? No. I love a lot of the creative concepts. I love the side content. I love the world that it exists in. I just wish that the narrative was better. But you know what? I'm just going to act like that whole Walking Dead comparison and running out of steam was actually planned from the start as an illusion for the entire game and not just me accidentally writing in something. But in all seriousness, I would just like to say thank you if you made it to the end of the video. It genuinely means a lot. And I've said it countless times before, but I am actually so sorry that this video took as long as it did. It definitely should not have, but a lot of real life stuff mixed with other stuff that I'm not going to get into right now, and doesn't matter anymore. Video's out, and thank you so much for making it to the end. If you have any complaints, critiques, anything like that, make sure to leave a comment because I'm genuinely still looking to improve. Anyways, that's besides the point. Again, thank you so much for making it to the end of the video, and thank you. Later.